So it's John Johnson, VP for NSF Health Sciences. This is our third in the series of our GMP podcasts. And you'll probably remember the first podcast that I did was about best practices in communication during COVID or any other type of crisis in our industry. And the second one, I did that with my wife, Mandy, talking about the QA product disposition process during tough times like we're in at the moment. And we were able to share some nice war stories and watch outs during those podcasts. We had a lot of hits and likes, and we wanted to expand this further today, really to introduce some new expertise to the podcast. I'm joined today by my colleague and friend, Paul Merrick. Hi, Paul.
Hi, John.
Really good to speak to you this morning. Paul brings to NSF 30 years experience in the industry across a range of corporate and operational roles, primarily AstraZeneca in Macclesfield in the UK. He's a fellow of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, and I feel somewhat in the shadow here because, as I always say, as a mere chemist, I really don't know one end of the spanner from another. So it's great to have Paul here to help me with this particular subject that we're going to cover today. And we're going to cover the GMPs associated with engineering services in the pre and post-COVID era that we're in. So Paul and I have a lot in common. We're really into a GMP and good documentation practice and lean and Kaizen projects. And we also love a couple of really nice pubs in where we live here in Buxton in Derbyshire. So Paul, very warm welcome.
Thank you, John.
So Paul, most of our clients are now introducing a phased and controlled return to work, which is really great to see because many of them have been furloughing staff or mothballing facilities now, some even regrettably suspending clinical trial manufacturing projects. So it's been really, really tough, and we're seeing shutdowns now running up to and including a 6 months period of shutdown. So from what you're seeing, Paul, how are you seeing the industry pan out in the next 3 to 6 months?
I think it's a challenge in many aspects, but it's about startup really, and managing that startup and assessing the risk and working critically as a multidisciplined team. You maybe liken it to starting up a new facility. I mean, essentially everything's been stood in most facilities, so you need to treat it as a project, but that also applies to bringing people back online as well from a competence and skills ability, if you like, because they've been out of the game a while.
Yeah, Mandy and I often talk about how easy it was to define a lockdown, but how difficult it is to define a phased unlockdown. So when you've had a shutdown in your facility and you want to get back up and running, and there's huge demand for pharmaceutical capacity just now, how do firms manage this in the most effective way, Paul?
I think they need to understand just when and how was it switched off? Was a facility closed up? Liken it to something that you're familiar with. If you leave your house or you leave your car or you mothball anything, it's the same principle. How do I get back? What do I need to do? And who's going to help me to do that?
So the facilities, utilities and equipment need managing, but what about people when they've not been operating those procedures for 6 months or more?
Yeah, I think you need to bring the people back on stream, not one at a time, but don't bring them all in tomorrow. If you've got 30 technicians work for you, bring them in slowly but surely, based on where do you want to focus them, what the priorities are, and making sure that they are comfortable and competent to approach the tasks to hand at a time.
Yeah, we know that many of our clients are spending this time trying to fix some legacy issues before they get back up and running. So, for example, with the new requirements in the Draft Annex 1 for Udrilex, many firms are trying to upgrade their facilities just now. So just talk me through the key steps in making those changes and then getting back up and running to make commercial pharmaceutical product.
Yeah, well, you treat it like any project shutdown, but change control is critical, and the competence of the people working within the team, whether they be full-time staff or contractors, is absolutely vital. That it is a team effort and the risks are assessed to progress to an end result. And how will the people that didn't see the change accept the change? And are SOP updates put in place? What about competencies from a training point of view, etc.? Everything needs considering.
Yeah, and it's not just about engineering, is it? We're going to talk a little bit more in a minute about QA oversight and bringing them on stream with you. But we're also hearing, Paul, that there's a lack of available talent and experience out there in some key areas. So firms are looking more to outsourcing. Any key advantages and disadvantages from your perspective in that?
I think if you're outsourcing, by all means bring in the skills from an outsourced contractor that you are, if you like, requiring more of or don't have in-house. But it's management oversight for us from a technical point of view and a QA point of view to see to ensure you know who's responsible and accountable for what aspects of that work. But I don't have any problem with outsourcing anything as long as it's managed and controlled.
Yeah, so you want really clear roles, responsibility, authority. Absolutely. And obviously, ultimately, you need a single point of contact, don't you?
Yeah, and you do need that single point of contact to control the whole process so that there's no duplication and things don't slip through the gaps.
So let me ask you a question I really should have asked you probably years ago. You know, for somebody who's so poor at understanding anything to do with engineering, you know, I can barely change a plug in my house. I don't know one end of a spanner from another. Why are QA actually asked to sign off outsourced engineering certificates?
Some QA people have asked me that in the past, particularly when we were looking at computer system validation. But essentially, it's because the CFRs and the Udrelex or Orange Guide or whatever, they dictate that you must have QA oversight as an independent authority. And it is important that that's in place. But as a technical person, I think it's also important that we explain to our QA colleagues how some systems work and try and keep it in layman's terms so that the QA person or the QP or whoever does feel comfortable when they put their very valuable signature on a document to satisfy the regulatory authorities, and they don't feel uncomfortable in doing that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. My signature is the most valuable possession that I have, Paul, and I don't want to give it away at 4:30 signing a certificate that I can barely understand. So it's always good to be kept on side by the engineers. One of the things I always look for as well on a certificate is whether there's any information about how the equipment was found, what condition was it found in. Just explain to us the importance of as found versus as left.
Well, if the person approaching any system or piece of equipment or instrument doesn't note the as found state, whether that's in a lot of detail or just a simple, it's switched off. But particularly with an instrument, it needs to be what was the calibrated state in the as found state, because that supports the quality aspects of product release in many cases. And it's really important that everybody knows, in case of investigations, deviations, etc., how was the system, instrument or whatever in the as found state.
Yeah, I want to know that it's performed according to its validated status for the whole duration since the last successful PPM or calibration, don't I?
Absolutely. And was it, if it was out of tolerance or out of spec, how much was it out of spec and how's that affected the quality of product made during that period?
Yeah, it just brings it home to me just how important that relationship is between engineers and QA. Fundamentally being able to do a risk assessment when a condition is found that is unacceptable or unusual. So what about setting up these contracts with a service provider? Any particular issues that you've seen in your career with working with outsourced engineers?
I think it's a relationship that needs to be developed to make sure that you understand who's responsible, who's accountable. You can do some background research to make sure that they've got a good name in the industry or industries similar to pharmaceuticals. Some of them don't. So let's say nuclear or aerospace. But you can do historical research, and it's about developing the relationship with them, not just using them willy-nilly off the shelf, if you like. It's good to have a long-term relationship.
And how careful have you got to be to make sure that any engineering contractors respect your clean room gowning and clean room conditions?
I think if you've got any concerns there, you need somebody with them, chaperoning them. Otherwise, if they bring the skills with them, then you can check the competency and sign them off.
And just thinking about the GMP documents as well related to that work and the certificates that they generate. For me as a QP or quality director, I'm always very interested in the small print, the terminology. abbreviations and acronyms can be just as prevalent in engineering as they are, regrettably, in QA. I'm always very interested in good documentation practice and the governance of good, accurate data. But the thing that I always be very careful about is fettling. So this is the kind of uncontrolled minor adjustments and improvements that engineers can make, sometimes that are not always well documented. Have you had any experience of that? How do you control that, Paul?
Yeah, it's always difficult because technicians love to change things and just make things run a little better, or, I've just tweaked this because it wasn't quite running right. But they need to understand what the impact of their fettling, for want of a better word, has on the system that is in a validated state and qualified state when they went to it, and that they've not upset that. So I think it's all about training and educating them. You can't just twiddle this and fettle that, and it's important that isn't done. Absolutely. So really, for me, the take-home messages from this podcast is to invest in the knowledge of GMP, not just in your engineering team, but also in your QA team and how they work together, and also thinking about any service providers, because ultimately we're all held to the same standards of good documentation practice, and QA ultimately should be a law facilitation service, not a law enforcement service. What about your key messages, Paul? I think I'd just reiterate that, John, and I think somebody once said to me, QA are policemen. They are not policemen, they're crime prevention officers. That's
a good way of putting it. I like that. Well, Paul, thanks very much. This podcast is going to be posted on our website, nsf.org. It'll be on LinkedIn, and we're going to send it direct to our valued clients, and I'm sure many of them will be very interested to hear what you've had to say today, Paul. Ultimately, I think in the current situation we're in, there's really no need to add to the drama that we're all facing. We've really got to focus on what's truly important, be there for each other, and help keep everyone aligned to the purpose of their roles. Whether you're an engineering or QA or operations, we're all here to help preserve and improve world health. Hopefully you got something out of that podcast. Please like it as you see it, and we'll be speaking again soon. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Paul.
Thanks, John.